Today, we will explore a lesser-known world of medieval history, the daily lives of women who lived in European convents between the 12th and 13th centuries, women who withdrew from the world to devote every moment of their lives to prayer, to work, and to spiritual pursuit. The year is 1200. We are somewhere in Europe. A bell rings, breaking the silence of dawn. Yet the sky is still ruled by darkness. In a shared dormitory, dozens of women rise from their straw mattresses. The cold seeps into their bones, but they do not hesitate. With movements rehearsed through the repetition of hundreds of identical mornings, they wrap themselves in their heavy woolen habits and form a silent procession through the stone corridor. Their steps are muffled, almost inaudible, as if even walking were a form of reverence. They move toward the chapel, dimly lit by the trembling light of a few candles, and there, in that cold, half-dark space, their voices rise as one Gregorian chants fill every crack of the ancient walls, echoing as if the building itself were breathing through the melody, while the rest of the world still rests beneath blankets. They perform the first prayer of the day. This simple scene holds within it the essence of an entire existence. For medieval nuns, every day was a careful copy of the one before it, and every gesture, no matter how ordinary, carried the weight of a sacred purpose. But who were these women who chose a life so radically different from everything the secular world could offer? To understand life behind the cloister walls, we must first understand what led a young woman in medieval Europe to step through the gates of a convent, often knowing she might never return. In medieval society, a woman's options were extremely limited. The most common path was marriage, arranged by families for political, economic, or social gain. The alternative was religious life. For some, this choice came from a true calling, a deep desire to be closer to God in a complete and personal way. They longed for a life of contemplation, of prayer, far from the distractions and temptations of the outside world. But it would be naive to assume that all nuns entered the convent with mystical passion. Many were placed there by their families. For example, noble families often had more daughters than advantageous marriages available. When dowries and alliances were exhausted, offering a daughter to the church became a solution, combining devotion with practicality. The young woman entered the convent, and the family fulfilled both a religious duty and a social necessity. And then there were those who came seeking refuge, widows, women escaping hardship, or noble women who found within the cloister a sense of safety no longer offered by the outside world. The convent also represented one of the rare places where women could receive formal education. They learned to read, to write, to speak Latin, and to understand music, no matter the reason. Once the decision was made, there was little turning back. A young woman who wished to become a nun first entered a period known as the novitiate. This could last a year or even longer. During this time, she learned the prayers, became familiar with the rules, and was carefully observed by the novice mistress, the nun responsible for guiding and evaluating her. If she endured, if she was accepted, then came the moment of vows, a solemn ritual in which the young woman committed herself for the rest of her life. Poverty, chastity, obedience. She renounced all personal property, marriage, an independent choice. Her hair was cut, symbolizing the abandonment of worldly vanity. She received her habit and her veil, marking her as a consecrated woman. From that moment, the convent became her entire universe. From that moment, the convent became her entire universe. The life that awaited her within those walls was governed by a precise structure. Most convents followed the rule of Saint Benedict, originally written in the 6th century for monks, but widely adopted by female communities. This rule established a balance between 3 pillars: prayer, work, and community life. This principle was summarized in the Benedictine phrase, ora et labor, pray and work. The architecture of a medieval convent reflected this philosophy. At its center stood the chapel, the heart of the community. Around it were arranged the dormitory, the refectory, the kitchen, storage rooms, and the chapter house, all surrounding a central courtyard known as the cloister, often enclosed by covered walkways. Everything was intentionally simple. Everything was functional. Everything was directed toward a single purpose: to guide the mind toward God. And within this simple setting, the nun's day unfolded, marked by an unchanging rhythm, a rhythm that transformed time itself into an act of devotion. The backbone of this routine was the cycle of canonical hours, the divine office, divinum offic, which divided the 24-hour day into sacred intervals of prayer long before dawn. While the sky was still a deep, starless black, the nuns were awakened for the first and most solemn of these services, matins, also known as the night vigil, depending on the tradition. It could begin at midnight or in the earliest hours before sunrise. The nuns gathered in the church, still wrapped in darkness, and there, by the trembling light of candles, they recited psalms and sacred texts to offer praise while the entire world slept. Was considered a profound act of devotion. After Mass came a shorter service welcoming the sunrise, and then, with the arrival of daylight, the flow of canonical hours continued without interruption. Prime, around 6 in the morning; terce, around 9; sext, at midday; none, around 3 in the afternoon. Each office relatively short, consisting of psalms, hymns, and prayers, but together they formed an unbroken chain of devotion, dividing the day into segments of work and prayer. No matter what a nun was doing, whether tending the garden, sewing garments, or copying manuscripts, when the bell rang, announcing the next office, she stopped immediately, without delay, and returned to the chapel. Obedience to the bell was absolute, undeniable. The most important liturgical event of each day was the Mass, usually celebrated in the morning because nuns could not be ordained As priests, a chaplain or a monk from a nearby monastery was called to lead the service. The nuns observed from behind a screen or a grille which marked the boundary of the cloister. They listened to the Latin prayers and received communion through a small opening. The Mass was the spiritual peak of the day, the moment when the sisters believed that Christ was truly present among them. As evening approached, the community gathered again for Vespers, the evening prayer, singing psalms of gratitude as the sun set beyond the horizon. And finally came the last office of the day, a soft, contemplative service in which the nuns sought divine protection for the coming night. After the great silence was declared, the convent was immersed in total silence. Not a single word was spoken until the next morning. The nuns withdrew to their beds, and the only sound that would break the silence was the bell calling them once again in the darkness of dawn to return to the chapel and begin again the endless cycle of prayer. In total, a medieval nun spent several hours each day in communal prayer. This relentless routine could be exhausting, especially with the duty of waking in the night, but it was considered a perfect form of sacred service. The sound of chants rising together at any hour of day or night was the pulse of the convent, a sign that every moment belonged to God. But life in the convent was not only prayer. Between the liturgical offices, there existed a world of work that was necessary to sustain the community. Monastic tradition taught that idleness was the greatest enemy of the soul, and so, when they were not in the chapel, the nuns devoted themselves to productive tasks, ranging from the most demanding manual labor to the most refined intellectual activities. One of the most common and important occupations was textile work. For long hours, the nuns spun wool or linen. They wove cloth, sewed garments, and repaired worn clothing. They produced their own habits, their bedding, and often liturgical textiles, such as altar cloths and priestly vestments. Medieval convents were especially known for the quality of their embroidery. Some communities became famous for garments adorned with gold and silk thread, true works of art that combined technical skill with spiritual devotion. A nun might spend days seated by a narrow window, carefully stitching images of saints into a single piece of fabric, each stitch offered as an act of devotion. Such delicate work was not merely productive labor, it was also a form of prayer, a way of beautifying the house of God and expressing the glory of divine creation through the work of human hands. Alongside textile work, some nuns devoted themselves to a rarer and more valuable activity, the production of books. Some convents possessed libraries and even rooms dedicated to writing, similar to those found in male monasteries. Educated nuns spent time in Lectio Divina, the sacred reading of scripture and theological texts, but they also copied manuscripts by hand, although monks are more often remembered as scribes. there is clear evidence of women participating in this activity. One remarkable example is the German nun Good, who lived in the 12th century. She worked as a scribe and an illuminator, decorating manuscripts with intricate detail. Good copied and illustrated a collection of sermons, and within one of the decorated letters she included alongside an inscription identifying herself as the creator of the work. Modern scholars consider this one of the earliest known signed self-portraits by a woman in Western manuscript tradition. Another fascinating discovery reinforces this participation. In Dalheim, Germany, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a medieval nun dating from the 11th to 12th centuries. Within her teeth, they found traces of ultramarine pigment, a rare blue pigment made from lapis lazuli. This suggests that she was an illuminator, and that over time she had unknowingly ingested tiny particles while shaping her brush with her lips. This material evidence provides a tangible glimpse into the artistic work of medieval nuns. Yet not every nun was an imp or a scribe. Many focused on practical tasks essential to daily survival. In the kitchen, they prepared meals, baked bread, and brewed beer. At that time, water was not always safe to drink, so beer, with a very low alcohol content, served as a reliable source of hydration. In the gardens, they grew vegetables, herbs, and fruits. They cared for animals, such as chickens, which provided eggs to supplement their diet. Clothing was constantly maintained, washed, repaired, in a continuous cycle of care. Within the convent structure, different nuns were assigned specific roles. The cared for the sick, using herbal remedies. The maintained the chapel and its sacred objects. The alm distributed charity to the poor at the gates of the convent. In larger and wealthier convents, some of the heavier labor was done by hired workers, but in smaller communities, the nuns themselves performed every task. Compared to monks, nuns generally engaged in less intensive agricultural labor, and in the 12th century, the Abbess Heloise argued that imposing the same physical demands was not realistic. Yet, regardless of the task, the principle remained the same. Every capable nun had daily duties, and every task was understood as an extension of prayer. Even activities considered recreational, such as creating religious art or composing liturgical music, served a spiritual purpose, and here it is impossible not to mention Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098 in the Rhine region, she was the 10th child of a noble family. From a young age, she experienced mystical visions. At the age of 8, she was sent to be educated at a Benedictine convent. After the death of her mentor, she was chosen as the leader of the community. Throughout her life, she composed more than 70 sacred hymns, wrote major theological works, and produced writings on medicine and natural history. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and bishops. She founded monasteries and even preached publicly, something highly unusual for a woman of her time. She was later canonized and declared a doctor of the Church. Though her life was extraordinary, it reveals the intellectual and creative potential that could emerge within the convent. Yet daily life within the convent also included aspects that may seem strict, even severe, to a modern observer. Discipline was constant, silence was essential, and personal comfort was not a priority. Silence, in particular, was a central element of monastic life. Most convents imposed long periods of mandatory silence, especially at night. After the Great Silence was enforced, and until morning, no nun was permitted to speak even during the day. Unnecessary conversation was discouraged. To communicate without breaking silence, the nuns developed a system of gestures, simple hand signs, allowing them to request bread, water, or other necessities without making a sound. This culture of silence served two purposes: to encourage inner contemplation and to prevent idle gossip, which was seen as a threat to harmony. Meals were simple and carefully regulated, typically 1 or 2 meals a day. In summer, a main meal at midday and a lighter one in the evening. In winter, when more energy was needed, meals could be slightly more substantial. The diet was mostly vegetarian. The rule of Saint Benedict forbade the consumption of 4-legged animals, except in cases of illness. Typical meals included bread, porridge, vegetable soups, sometimes fish or eggs as sources of protein. The usual drink was water or fermented beverages, such as light beer, safer than untreated water. During fasting periods, such as Lent or on Fridays, meals became even more modest, sometimes reduced to bread and broth. Meals were taken in silence, seated together at long tables, while one nun read aloud from a religious text, thus nourishing both body and spirit. Before and after each meal, they offered prayers of thanks. Living conditions were simple, adequate, but austere. The nuns slept in shared dormitories, on straw mattresses covered with wool blankets. They often slept in their clothing so they could rise quickly when the bell rang. In the middle of the night, a single lamp or candle might remain lit, providing faint guidance through the darkness. In some wealthier convents, dormitories were later divided into small wooden partitions, but privacy was minimal, almost non-existent. Personal possessions were few or none at all. The vow of poverty allowed little ownership. Clothing was uniform, simple, rough, functional, black for Benedict, lighter tones for grey or brown for the followers of St. Clare. The habit served as a constant reminder of renouncing luxury. Discipline was maintained under the authority of the abbess. Minor infractions, such as speaking out of turn or arriving late to prayer, resulted in small penances, extra prayers, or symbolic acts of humility. More serious violations were rare, but when they occurred, they caused great scandal. A nun who broke her vows or attempted to leave could face severe punishment, even expulsion. Records of episcopal visits reveal that abbess often had to correct daily misconduct. Some nuns kept pets, despite the rules. Others formed small groups or engaged in gossip, a reminder that even within strict walls, human nature finds expression. Yet the convent was not without joy. On feast days, rules were relaxed. The liturgy became more celebratory. The chapel was decorated with flowers. Meals became richer. Moments of lightness, rare but meaningful. Stories tell of communities celebrating sacred days with great enthusiasm, even allowing music and decoration. These moments revealed something essential, that even in simplicity, even in discipline, they remained human. The structure of the convent was clearly defined. At its head stood the abbess, the spiritual mother, an administrative leader, often elected by the community itself. She oversaw discipline, managed resources, represented the convent in dealings with the outside world. Beneath her, other roles existed: the novice mistress, each with responsibilities. In smaller convents, one person might fulfill several roles. In larger ones, each task had its own specialist. Over time, deep bonds formed between the sisters. They prayed together, worked together, lived side by side, from morning until night. Elder nuns guided the younger ones. Friendships formed, strong, enduring. Some described these bonds as stronger than blood. In illness, they cared for one another. In death, they gathered to mourn, to pray, and to bury their sister. Within the convent grounds, a mixture of grief and faith. But like all human communities, there were tensions, conflicts, disagreements, even rivalries, especially during elections or moments of leadership change. To manage this, they held daily gatherings, known as the chapter, where nuns could confess faults or express concerns, allowing issues to be resolved before they grew. This system reflected centuries of practical wisdom. Life within the convent was separate, but not completely isolated. They maintained connections with the outside world through priests, through letters, through visitors. Families could visit under strict rules, separated by barriers, in designated spaces. Nuns could send and receive letters with permission. They also engaged in charity, distributing food to the poor, offering help from within their walls. Some convents provided care for sick or vulnerable women. Others educated young girls, teaching reading, writing, and religious knowledge. Their prayers were believed to protect the world, especially in times of crisis, plague, war, famine. Despite everything, the convent endured across centuries. Through hardship, through change, most nuns remained unknown. Their names lost to history, but their lives were filled with meaning, not through fame, but through repetition, through devotion, through quiet persistence. Day after day, year after year, they rose before the sun and ended in silence. Their lives became a continuous offering of time, of labor, of faith, and perhaps that is what makes their story so deeply human. Not grand acts, but small ones, repeated with care, with patience, with belief. And even now, their story remains soft, quiet, enduring like a candle, burning in the dark. If this story has touched you, if it offered you something new, consider supporting it. Subscribe, share, and tell me what stayed with you. Because, just like those candles that once lit the cloister, your presence helps keep these stories alive.